Almost 3 years ago, when I first joined Grubhub, I had no idea what A/B testing was. I was tasked to implement the A/B testing framework. That was my first thing, and I did it. And since that, all the product owners began testing every chance they can. For them, it was as easy as making sure that developers implement their features on time and pray that execute the experiments and pray that their experiment wins, or at least hope so. And their job was done. At least that's what they thought it was. And it's not as easy as they think. So I'm going to tell you my experiences with A/B testing because it doesn't come for free. I learned some things that will help me as a developer to make my life easier, and I hope that if you were to experiment with A/B testing, maybe you could find it useful for yourself as well. And before I jump into my talk, let me share a little bit about myself. I started as a software engineer at Google. I was part of their fraud detection team. Back then, we were doing AI or decision trees to detect frauds, and it was pretty much services for the other teams. In IBM, I became a consultant. So I got a chance to become a software developer, outsourced to different companies in different industries. So I got a lot of exposures in terms of being a full stack developer for them. And my big break into mobile development actually happened after a year of begging one of the mentors from the mobile team. I asked him, give me an opportunity to do mobile development. And the closest thing that he gave me was to develop the web services for the first retail banking application for Royal Bank of Canada, which I was very happy to do. So that was my big break into mobile development. I got connected with other IBM developers who were iOS engineers, and they were willing to teach me all about iOS development. So what I did is actually I sucked it up. I bought my own MacBook Pro, and I took the IBM laptop and the MacBook Pro every day with me, just so that once I finish my day-to-day job, I get to ask them questions about iOS development. And fast forward, I got a chance to lead the development team at Royal Bank of Canada to build their first hybrid application for the first commercial banking app. And then I led a team of 15 developers. And then fast forward, a team of 50 developers to rebuild the entire retail banking application. So I have a lot of exposure into mobile development. And at Grubhub, as a senior iOS engineer, we do a lot of A/B testing. From then, it actually affects development and testing a little bit different. So I'm going to show you my experiences about that. And so to just jump in, what is A/B testing? A/B testing, you could think of 4 ways. This is coming from my experience. The first one is A/B testing is testing a hypothesis. Usually, a product owner or a designer or user research, they have a hunch feeling that, oh, this is going to be a hit. This feature is going to be great. But they don't know for sure. So in order to know for sure, we try it out. So another time is that when a hypothesis comes up is if they learn some new insight from an existing experiment that they ran and that didn't do well, for example. So in order to do this, A/B testing allows you to do feature flagging. It is as simple as turning on and off a feature to enable the experiments. You could test anything that you can see, visually experience, such as you could do icon changes, colors, layout. I'm going to show you some examples later on of some of the experiments that I've done. You could also control user flows. But this thing, they always have a big impact to the users. So what's the good thing about A/B testing is that you are able to control the rollout to the users. So you don't have to impact everyone. You could actually let some users try it out. If the feature turns out very well, then we make it available to everyone. If not, then we iterate a little bit over it to make it sure that it's actually good before we roll it out to everyone. And sometimes if it doesn't work well, we just make sure we turn it off or not make it available to anyone. So as a result of having control rollout, it brings us to the next point. We're able to innovate without impacting a lot of users. We minimize the risk of doing that, and we don't hurt the bottom line of the company. So we could test anything that is measurable. For example, some things that we do at Grubhub, how we measure success, we want to make sure that, for example, increase the conversion or increase the number of orders, for example, or increase even the volume of the order, the per visitor. A/B testing sounds great. You can test hypotheses. You can let some folks try things out. You could also have a way to control it, roll it out to some features. If it works well, great. If it doesn't, just shut it down. And so far, we learned all the good things about A/B testing. But the main top of this is the next part, which I'll share. A/B testing is actually very messy, and I'll tell you why. So this is sometimes that developers are not aware of, because the product owners or anyone that's monitoring the test, they could turn off the experiment because they see that it's actually not doing well without notifying the development team, right? We're in the dark. This code base never gets hit in production, but it's sitting there in the code base looking pretty, right? And in turns, this actually adds a lot of work for developers and also the QA testing team. I'll tell you why. In terms of development work for developers, we actually have to, when we implement new features, we have to consider existing experiments that are still running. And we also have to make sure that we're not breaking anything. Like we have to test the different variations that are still working. And sometimes we have to build around the experiments or on top of it and make sure that we don't break them. The QA and development team, well, sometimes the QA team doesn't necessarily trust the developers, so they're doing the test. So in reality, the QA team will also have to do their own testing. So they have to test the new features in addition to all the variations and the existing experiments to make sure that they're still working properly. And A/B testing is actually not for everyone. This was very funny because I was very excited about A/B testing, so I went home and talked to my wife about it. And I was telling her all about this, and she got excited. And she's like just switched to a company recently to lead the whole mobile team. And they didn't have a working mobile product, so they didn't have a lot of users. So I told her, wait. So I created this slide, especially for her, and sometimes if you have questions about this as well. It's actually, if you don't have a lot of users, so it doesn't make sense for you to do A/B testing. You should have a lot of users so that it make it statistically important. Because part of the A/B testing, there's a selection criteria to make sure that they qualify. And from those users that qualify, you distribute to the developers, to the users that qualify. So the funnel is actually narrows down. The other thing is, if you're lacking resources in setting up the experiments, you might not want to do this. She was the only product owner for the mobile team, so it didn't make sense to actually block herself in terms of rolling out new features that she wanted to actually bring it out to the users. And the other thing is, if you're early in your product development stages, you don't want to do A/B testing. At Grubhub, just want to read the numbers to make sure I don't get it wrong. So we have around 400,000 orders per day. We have 15 million active users, and about 60% of those are made through mobile. So it makes sense for us to do A/B testing. Now that you know what A/B testing is and what it is not, let's see who actually drives A/B testing. And this, depending on the company that you ask, at Grubhub is actually mainly the product owners, but sometimes the developers get a chance to drive some experiments. We have what they call Hackathon. It's pretty much an internal hackathon for the employees. And I'll share some of the experiments that we did, that I initiated. That was fun. And the product owners, they actually look at the numbers after this experiment gets run to see if it's actually doing well. So they would tell you if it's actually a go or no go. Ultimately, we don't want experiments to actually hurt the bottom line of the companies. So just a recap, A/B testing, I told you, is about feature flagging. You can innovate without while minimizing the risk. And also because of A/B testing, you have increased development and testing effort. And it is actually not for everyone. So now that you know, I'll share you some of the experiments that I've done at Grubhub. Maybe it'll help you inspire some examples on your own. So you'll never forget your first losing experiment. Okay, Coach Bubble was the first thing that I had to implement for the company. And the challenging part was that we were supporting iOS 8. I think it didn't have like the pop-up that comes with the framework in later OS versions. So I have to customize everything, make sure it works on all the different devices. It didn't take long to implement, but you know, it's your first losing experiment, so I remember forever. This is how it looks. It was very simple. It was an idea by a product owner. They said, oh, you know, how do we introduce the new features to the user? Let's use coach bubbles. So we implemented this. For example, if there's something new in the filters, we want to point them out. And the other thing is there are some other new features on the iPad. We also have to support that. So my little widget was very customizable, very flexible. You could use it, point it anywhere. But it didn't win. So what happened? I had to remove a lot of code. So hackathon, that's the experiments that I've done. So we call it hackathon, but it doesn't matter. It's hackathon. So the main idea of a hackathon that we had is you have a requirement was that anybody can come up with an idea, except that you have to have a product owner, a designer, and a developer. So one thing that we create, the first thing, we've run it this 2 years already so far. So my first year, we won first place. This was a very simple idea. It was a schedule order entry point, mainly because the product owner, they do a lot of user testing. So they ask the participant to actually schedule an order, right? So the participant always went to the menu, and then they went to a tab menu item that says scheduled orders. So they went there. It's actually just to see their previous schedule orders, but there was an empty state, and that's it. So her idea was, hey, why don't we just make it easier for them to actually schedule an order? Just introduce a button there. So the experiment was very simple. So this was the design from the designer. So we introduced the flow in there so that they could actually schedule order. So this was just not the first screen that they see without the button. So this actually helped increase the number of orders in our platform. That's very exciting. We got gift card for food that lasted for a while. So the second experiment, this one actually was very funny. You know the iPhone X is so expensive. So Christmas Eve, they had a deal that I could trade in my phone. They'll give me like $400 or something for my old phone, and then give me a new iPhone and in exchange for some money. So I said, sure. So let's try it out. So I was testing out some apps, and I sensed like, hey, what is this feeling that's kicking on my hand? It was the haptic feedback. It's like, I have to have this. I have to integrate this in our app. So what I did is just within a couple hours, I implemented the haptic feedbacks in our app in places that it makes sense. It has to be related to some animations. So we won third place in there. And so this time, because experiments was getting much better, I actually got stocks for this. So it was very happy, and iPhone X was worth it. I got it covered with the stocks. So little things help increase user delight. So an example of a flow. This one, the product owner said that for a lot of, so let me show you what it is. So the product owners, they noticed that if you're a new visitor, you tend to don't have any orders, right? So it makes sense for you to show you the search results screen. While people who have ordered from us before, they tend to just reorder. So on app launch, what we did is just default them to the different tab based on their app launch. So also that helped. Very simple things. So sometimes for experiments, it takes multiple iterations to win, right? So Grubhub review with many items. I thought this was a very interesting idea because I thought, oh, for sure it's gonna win. Like, you know, like people wants to see what I actually order, and they can actually just order. And then so we experiment this a little bit. So the text you see is their name and they order. The initial text was Emily, enjoy, and then the list of many items, but actually they provided a bad review. So we don't want to say that they enjoy. So we changed the text to make it a little bit generic. But this experiment, this was the first version, it didn't win. And so the product owner, they said, we need to give a more sign for the users coming to our app as an entry point, right? So we have our menu. All I did is just add a number to the number of reviews. So that gave them a hint to the users that, hey, there's orders that you can check out. And that actually helped the experiment win. So sometimes it takes multiple times. And restaurant promotions, that's another big project that I worked on because everyone loves promotion. I'm cheap. I tend to like to save money and try out different restaurants. So this was, I thought for sure it's going to win, you know? But then when we first introduced this, it didn't have the illustration. So it didn't win. But after adding illustration, oh yeah, wow, now the users can see it. So that experiment won. And for the second part, which we introduced is part of the entry point on the search results screen, we had a carousel. And I'll share with you some of the test cases that we had to do in order to test. So if you see the carousel on your first screen, we had a basic carousel. It didn't win the first time, but we beefed it up to make it look a little better with even the number of % off. And hopefully, once you launch your app, if you try out Grubhub, you could see this deal and take advantage of this offer. So the other thing they play around with was the positioning to make it more obvious. And the other experiment was to just add a simple cuisine to the list. That actually helped the experiment win. But adding that simple thing was actually not as simple in order to come to testing. So this is an example of 5 test cases that the QA had to test. They had to enable the carousel variant to actually see the pretty carousel. And then from there, they had to switch on and off to make sure that they see the cuisine or not see the cuisine and the expectations. So because Seamless and Grubhub is the same app, we also had to test with the different variants, including E24. So all these cases times 3. So that is an example of a lot of testing that comes involved. And this one's the last example that I want to cover. Experiments, they actually take a long time. This is the first example where we actually changed the navigation from a drawer to the tab. This took approximately 8 months, which is a long time to have to support both variation and any new feature that you had to create. You had to support the drawer mode and you have to support the tab mode. So what helped a little bit is by creating automation tests. In general, the code base was a mess, right? We were like so desperately wanted to erase the drawer because that's what we wanted to migrate away from. That was the old design. So you see the first screen. This is what we wanted to move away from into the tab mode, which is the tab mode. We introduced a new tab called My Grubhub, and that comes to this screen, which a lot of those features we actually expanded here to show the actual orders, right? It looks nicer, it looks better, obviously, but it took a while for it to win. I think also because we're trying to figure out why it's not actually winning. I think once the users are used to one platform, it takes a longer time for them to switch over. So they did a lot of iterations to make it work. So the other experiment was redesigning or rebranding the whole application. So we switched from this red brand to this white design. And the thing is, for this, you have to go through all the screens to style it. So the process of the experiment wasn't that long, but it was implementation that took a long time. So we also introduced the feature toggles to make sure we disable it so that we could implement the entire experiment to make sure we touch all the screen. Any new features that we created, we also have to style it with the old brand and then the new brand. So this took a long time as well. So just a recap of the examples that I show you. Winning is not always guaranteed. And you can learn a lot from user observations to create your own experiments. And sometimes experiments, they take multiple iterations before it could win. And it takes a long time sometimes for experiments to win. So some of the keys for A/B testing success, just to make sure that we set up experiments for at least success, and I'll share you, success doesn't mean winning all the time. We need to make sure that the objectives are clearly defined. For us, is increasing the number of orders or increasing the volume of the order. Just have a way to measure it. The second part is we always want to think, what problems the users may encounter, and then develop or create experiments surrounding those behaviors that the user expect. And we learn from the results. So even if it doesn't win, we could learn from the results and actually improve upon it and create a second iterations or more. The goal is, I think John Maxwell quote is very summarizes these key points. You want to fail early, fail often, but always fail forward, right? So as long as we're gaining some new knowledge and learning something new, we're actually ahead already. And sometimes for us to understand the users, I think going through this experiment, it actually helps. But, losing is inevitable. I think this is a good thing for us to take away, to just try to fail often and, fail forward. But, in reality, losing or feeling like a loser is actually doesn't feel good. So I wanted to share with you how to be a good loser, because deleting code, it hurts. Especially if you implemented a feature that you think is going to be rolled out to everyone, but it doesn't make it. I want to share with you some tips on how we can hurt a little bit less. And luckily, most of the experiments that I've done last year won, so I didn't have to delete a lot of code. But one of my colleagues, he actually took one of the features that I had to implement because I didn't have time to implement it, right? So he took it, he implemented it, he did a good job. But unfortunately, that experiment didn't win, so I had to go in to delete his code. But I just wanted to make sure that we try all our best to actually make this experiment win, right? So I asked the product owner, are you sure we cannot actually improve this upon any further? And she said, no, we cannot do anything else. So I went in to read it, and I wasn't the only sad person. I told him to review my PR because I'm going to have to remove his feature. He said it was sad. So I wanted to share some strategies how we can learn to hurt a little bit less and move forward ourselves. So some of the lessons learned. The first one is understand what could go wrong and question assumptions. So when you're giving a ticket, don't just implement it right away. Ask the product owner, what are you trying to test? Why do you think it's a worthwhile experiment, right? Sometimes they might think that, we should set up experiments like this, but you could offer some input on how to test it better. And sometimes the product owners may not be aware of all their experiments that are still running that can conflict with their experiments. So make sure, things are clear with the product owners and don't implement right away, but help out in how to make this this experiment more successful. The other thing, lesson number 2. So I'm not here to promote any particular platform, but provide you a general guidance on how to evaluate the A/B testing framework. So we use Tabletic, so that's not a secret, but there's so many A/B testing frameworks out there. So what I've learned, A/B testing framework that we use, one of the product teams, they told us just implement it. We didn't get a chance to test it out, but it took a while for us to actually stabilize the platform a bit. Mainly because we have to sync it with our analytics, Google Analytics, and so that session take a little bit some time. And there's some features that was available for A/B testing, like doing visual experiment setup, that actually crashed part of our app. So we have to disable that feature. So once you evaluate the framework, just test it out, make sure it doesn't crash, but it's gonna take you some time to stabilize it. So the other thing that when you're looking at A/B testing framework, usually they provide you some out of the box in order to qualify your users. You could select based on device types, you can base on OS versions, application version. The other thing is, if it allows you to do customization, that's even better, because for us, for example, we wanted to select returning diners or new diners, right? So we were able to customize the qualification criteria. So that was pretty good. That was available for us. So once we qualify the user, it goes through a distribution. So you could say, we want 50% of these users to do this experiment, or sometimes if you have 3 variations, you want 30, 30, 30, or however you want to define it. So there's a distribution criteria. And setting up the goals, we don't use that a lot because we rely on our data that we collected from Google Analytics to verify or to measure our goals that is doing well. But we also find out that Google Analytics sometimes it misses some data. So what we started to do, we created our own analytics tracking framework in order to help out with this. So in GrabHub, another thing that we had to do, for one of the experiments, every time the developers will set up for three projects. So we have Seamless, we have GrabHub, we have E24, and for the product owners, they have to set up the production. So there's 3 different brands. So for each experiment, you have to set it up 6 times. So what we work with a vendor, we come up with a way to just customize it one time, one project, and it will work for all the brands. That helps us save a lot of time. So make sure you have a vendor that is, who will be able to work with you. And lesson number 3, question if everything needs to be feature toggle. Sometimes you don't need a feature toggle, right? So without having a feature toggle, the good thing is you could remove the old code, right? You don't want to maintain both variations, or the old one and the new one. So some things, for example, that doesn't need feature toggle, if you were to introduce a new framework, that the user doesn't actually see, right? So those don't need feature toggles. The other thing is, so I'll share one experience that I had. I convinced the product owner that we actually didn't need a feature toggle to share a menu item, right? If you have a menu, you want to share it to the other users. I didn't think that it's going to hurt conversion. I think it's going to help it, right? If you want to just measure that this feature is actually working well, why not just put analytics to it and make it available to everyone? So he agreed, but he forgot. So when he went into production, I got in trouble for just a short time, mainly because they started looking at the numbers. Whoa, it's actually increasing. It's like, it's being shared, that other menus are being shared and driving traffic into our app. So I was very happy that it worked out. But just in case, for the future, I learned that it might be better to add a kill switch, right? If they're afraid that this feature is going to crash the app or crash the users, maybe a kill switch might be better instead of a A/B toggle. Lesson number 4, create a debug setting screen, mainly to facilitate testing for all the products and all the QA tester and even ourselves, right? So for a feature toggle, just an example, for A/B testing, the Taplytics offer was the Boolean, true or false, to enable the feature, but you could also test a copy, right? So they offer string. They didn't really provide arrays, but we just pretty much provide an array, delimit it, so that we could parse it in and turn it into arrays. And the kill switch is pretty much just a feature to turn on and off, right? This is also very useful for testing. I'll show you an example of how our screen looks like. Right? Those are not actual experiments, so I didn't want to share that with you. Otherwise, I'll get into big trouble. So we have a major toggle to actually say, let's override all the remote toggles using the local one, right? You could also switch it off so that you could just use the Taplytics version or the optimized toggles. So some things, an example, you could do booleans that looks like a switch. And if you're testing order positions, you could include numbers or text. So this is just an example of how our debug settings look like. And lesson number 5, because experiments take a long time, and sometimes take a long time, especially like anything major, like the flow, the navigation that I show you. Make sure you automate tests. What we do is unit tests and functional tests to make sure that the old version is still running and the new version is still running well as well. Because it takes a long time, like 8 months. Imagine if they have to do manual testing for all those 8 months, that would be terrible. But with the automation test, the regression test was actually automated and facilitated testing much quicker, and we identify issues also quicker. So this is something that we wanted to do, that we actually did, that helped out. And don't forget to unit test your default feature flag values. Usually, when you introduce a new feature, the values should be disabled by default. Sometimes you might accidentally enable it for your testing while you're doing development. It makes it easier, but you don't want to go into production making it available for everyone, right? One of my features at the early stages got caught using this, so it was a good thing that we had a unit test for it. And lesson number 6, you want to write code that is actually easier to make permanent or delete. So for example, some things that I learned is you want to choose composition over inheritance. because composition, it makes it easier for cleanup. You can programmatically do the UI with the different variations instead of saying using storyboards. Sometimes it's not so clear or which variations you actually which variations belong to which one. Or you could use multiple nips, which is what I did. You could have multiple nips, for example, the carousel, the different designs. I have multiple nips in there. Once one variation won, I just removed the code very easily. And another thing that you want to salvage is creating reusable components. So that maybe this experiment doesn't win for this time, but you could reuse it for something else. Lesson 7. This is something that product owners forget. So this is on the developers to make sure we set up a cleanup process, right? Right now we just have a spreadsheet. We try to do it varies the product owners if their experiments have been running like more than 120 days, like highlight them in very bright color to make sure that this PM actually has an experiment running for 120 days. It's like, do we want to clean up or not, or are they iterating? We want to find out what's happening with that experiment, right? Because we don't want to maintain any experiments if they're no longer applicable. Some things that we keep track of, the product manager who's in charge of setting or who set up the experiment, the variable use, so that we could just look through the code and delete that code, when it started or ended the experiment, and the release of the app version that was released, and the winning variant. It could be just the baseline, rolling back to the baseline. I don't know if you see the smirk. So you don't have to go first sometimes. I learned that sometimes you could use the results from other platforms. Like Android, they also have to implement a similar experiment. But if it loses on them, you don't want to, maybe you could hold off a little bit, let them figure out which is the winning experiment, and you just implement the winning experiment. So you don't always have to go first. Just learn from the other platforms and just implement the winning experiments. The other thing is, what is in it for the product owners, right? You're proposing all these lessons that you learned, and you want to implement a cleanup process that will help us make development faster for the experiments. You can always tell them that, hey, if you don't help us with the cleanup process, your tickets or your new features is going to actually take longer to implement, because you have to handle all the different cases for the other experiments that are still running, right? So the other thing is, I think pretty much that implementation takes a little bit longer. So they might want to be, more willing to help you out in order to let you know when experiments loses or when they want to implement it permanently. The other thing is that experiments can sometimes take longer, so they'll be more willing to, let you add unit tests or functional tests just to automate it to help out. So there are pains and there's some good things about experimentations, but always the wins outweigh losses. So for us, if we actually don't innovate, then we're not able to create a better product than we have today. Our product looks much better than when I first joined, like over 2.5 or 3 years ago. And we want to do a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. So we do that in terms of software development. We try to always making the products better for the users, so that we, hopefully let them come back and be happier using our product. And just a quick takeaways, because I cover a lot of things. So I'm just going to summarize it into 3 points, so that's all you have to remember. Make sure that you check the assumptions and experiments. Don't always just implement whatever the tickets tell you. So work with the product owners. Make sure you set up a cleanup process. And decide whether it should be a feature flag or a kill switch. I lied, there's one more. And automate tests as much as possible, right? So I've actually concluded my talk and open to Q&A. If you have any questions for me. Yes?
Can you expand on what it means for an experiment and, for example, what the goals or how to measure the objectives? When you decide it?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So each experiment will have analytics associated with it. So for us, for example, the objectives is each time when we I'm not sure if you heard of DAGs, every time Grubhub, there's like daily average orders. So if we can actually boost that number with the compared to the baseline, that's how we measure that this is actually a winning experiment. So if it makes a significant impact, then we actually want to make that experiment permanent. So otherwise, we don't want to, bother with setting up that experiment if it doesn't make any difference. Yeah. Yes.
You said you used analytics. Did you choose that as a developer test? That was chosen for you.
Yeah. So yeah, there's other platforms available. So I think.
Did you ever see any other of them, or was it just
No, I think I don't know how it was figured out that, let's use Tabletics, but then another team is using another A/B testing platform that it seems to be working well for them, and they might want us to switch over as well. So I think it comes down to monetary, to whichever one gives you better value. But that's from a business perspective, right?
Well, that's the unfortunate. That's why I was asking you from a developer.
Yeah, I think right now we're holding back a little bit, mainly because it took us some time to stabilize this platform. So we say, if we don't have to, let's stay with Tabletics.
How do you decide if new features should be rolled out as like an A/B test versus just a whole feature rollout? For instance, like the tabs versus the side menu. Why not just go full tab? Like, because your product owners are presumably doing user testing, field testing, some of that sort of stuff, so they have an idea.
Yeah, I think that's what I think one of the experiments, that experiment was the longest ever. 8 months is a long time. We figure that, I always question in the product. It's like, if we wanted to roll out into a tab mode eventually, like that's the ultimate goal, why don't we just make it permanent? That would have saved so much headache instead of implementing in both versions. I don't know how they decided, but overall at Grubhub, they said any experiment has to be, any new features has to be A/B tested, but just they playing on the safe side because they don't want to hurt the conversion. So what I would suggest to them, sometimes if it doesn't make sense, like introducing frameworks or even some things that, if they want to measure how well the feature is working, why not introduce a kill switch to just make sure that it's working well? We could just add analytics. Analytics would tell you if it's actually working well or not, right? But sometimes they just want to compare, which one is better, the old version or the new version, and just to play it safe. Yes.
How thoroughly do you test all the combinations of device sizes and iOS versions and all the different features, and how do you balance that against hosting your build system?
So right now the good thing is we cut off a lot of older versions now, so we don't support like iOS 8 anymore. So we were celebrating this. Yeah, we don't have to support iOS 8, and they also recently eliminated iOS 9. So slowly, if it makes sense to the company, we're not going to develop any more new features for those old platforms. They can still use it, but then we just won't support any new features on it. So in terms of testing, our QA team is very good in terms of picking out things, but we try to automate everything, right? And we tend to use analytics to tell us how many of these devices or OSs are being used by the most users. So we tend to focus on testing majority of the users on those different platforms. So that's how we leverage instead of spending a lot of time on testing. Because right now, when I started, there was 2 weeks of development, but we narrowed down to 1 week now. So after 1 week, they only have a few days or so of regression tests, and then we roll out. So it's very short time. So we try to automate everything right now, and that's our push on the development team to actually we'll implement less features, but making sure that we automate and we test on different devices. And then the QA team will just make sure that they will test around it, or some things that might conflict with other experiments that development team didn't think about. So mainly just wisely choosing here and there. And our app is not perfect. I think it's a human thing, but we try to automate as much as possible. Yeah, and I think UI test is something that we wanted to tap on, but then that takes like a few hours to run. So it's actually a very painful process right now. But unit test is very quick to run, so we rely heavily on the unit test. Yes.
Interesting. So the first one was when you talked about like the tabs versus the
Mhm.
Like, which screenshots did you use in the app when you have like those two? And is that like a problem for Apple? Like if your app is quite different, like or where you're setting up different things?
Yeah, it wasn't a problem. That was surprising for me. That I don't know how Apple tested because there's so much different variations. So I don't know because the production app that goes out, they actually just get to see one version. So if they haven't seen anything fishy, just UI changes, then it's okay with them. But that's a good question. So far, we have been lucky for the past almost 3 years doing experiments. Yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to ask was like, how many experiments are you doing like converting? And how do you know that like you said your ultimate goal is like audit a week? If you've got 3 experiments going on at once, how do you know like, which one is like balancing?
Yeah. So there's actually once the app launches, we send analytics to identify which experiments is actually this user is qualifying for, right? So each step there is actually tracking in terms of if you're on a certain screen, we have an open screen event that we know the user is on these experiments and what kind of experiments they qualify. So the other thing is sometimes experiments they could conflict with each other and we don't know which one actually win or not. So they will have to rerun the experiments again. So that could happen. And the other thing is sometimes you could group experiments together to make it win together. So that's like one thing also developers ask is like, there's so many experiments running. Right now, I can't count how many experiments. We're hoping that we could get some winners.
Is that 3 figures from 6 experiments?
No, not that much. It's maybe under two figures. But I cannot say exactly. But yeah, there's a lot of experiments that is running. It's not only on our platform, but Android has their own A/B experiments, and also the web also have their own A/B experiments. We try to sync it all together with similar functionalities. Yeah. Yes.
So
I haven't got to the back, so you keep raising your hand. So
do you
maybe.
ever get feedback from your users who see an experiment and then it's gone and they get upset, and how do you track that?
Yeah, so we haven't had that issue, or at least I'm not sure. Like I haven't seen reviews like that. But that's a good point, right? You might like the experiment that is happening, you don't know that, and then later on you don't see it the next time, right? So what we do also is user experiments, user research even before that, right? So before we implement the experiments, we create mock-ups and then just interview the participants if they are able to navigate or think this version is better or the old version. So we even do some prior testing before we actually implement it. But yeah, that could happen. It's like I always wonder about that. But now that you're aware that we do A/B testing, you could let me know. Yes, the back, very back.
Okay, you mentioned letting other platforms go first sometimes, and you have that in Android as well. Do you ever find that results differ per platform?
Yeah, so not only that, but it also differs per brand. Sometimes the same experiments win on Grubhub, but loses on Seamless. I was like, what the heck? It's like the same experiment. It should win, but sometimes it's also what we have to do is we cannot release it until all platforms win, right? Not all the brand wins for that particular platform. Yeah, experiments can vary by different platforms, right? But sometimes I think we try to balance, but most of the time all the platforms will experiment and make sure that they have a actually winning experiment before we make it all permanent. That's the goal that we strive for, but sometimes it's inconsistent, but we see a win on Android, it's like running out of time, we want to make the platform in sync, let's implement it permanently on the iOS platform as well, or vice versa, right? So that's what we try to leverage, and it's up to the product owners to decide. Yeah. Back. We? Oh, okay. Yes.
So I'm curious, how do you craft your release notes with such a dynamic app? Because you want to call out some of these things.
You don't call it out. Yes. You don't call it out. Let people figure it out. So that's why I think the coach bubble is something that we attempted to show new features available, even without announcing it to the whole everyone. So we don't call out experiments. So if they're experiments, we know that it's not permanent, so we don't announce those.
You call it out once it's permanent.
Yes, we do.
it sounds like you have a lot of users to test against, but do you ever have problems with the statistical significance of results? Like if things are like really close.
We rerun it or make it better. So I think if it's very close experiments, we usually don't make it permanent. So that's what I think they have a threshold that they figure out if it passed certain threshold, it is a good amount, then we make it permanent. But if it's too close, even if it went a little bit, it won't become permanent. So they iterate again.
Do you find you have trouble in product groups kind of deciding how much win you need in order for it to be like taken up? Like, or do you kind of, it sounds like you run a lot of this, so like maybe do you have some kind of baseline that you expect it to meet to say, oh, this increased sales by a sufficient amount? You're like, well, that's an obvious.
Yeah,
it's good.
Yeah, they have a standard that across the whole company, so they have a threshold. It has to meet certain amount, but sometimes you barely pass by, we still make it permanent. We know that it's a little bit better user experience than before, so we make it permanent. But we have to pass a certain threshold. Yes.
Does everything we tested against basically whether it be more money?
So far, yes. Yes, but obviously the new design looks much better than before, right? But it still took a long time to make it permanent. Even though that our goal is actually just to, it looks much better. Let's make it permanent. Why do we experiment? But ultimately, it's not hurting.
Looking at conversion.
Yeah, looking at conversion. Yes.
So, since you mentioned that you guys are running on 1 week sprints, does that mean that the A/B testing decision making between the product owners and the designers is running a week ahead of you guys?
No, they actually take much longer to run. So they have I don't know if I could share the length of time, but they take a longer time to run to make sure that it's actually stabilized. Because once you roll out a new feature, it tends to be not a lot of users have downloaded the app. So we cannot measure at that point if it's success or not, right? So we let it run for a bit until a lot of users download the latest version, and then they test it. They measure. Yeah, that's a good question too. Yes.
When you, in regards to removing code, do you guys squash your commits and then just roll back that one large commit? Do you keep feature branches around for a really long time and go live?
No, so we have one major branch. So the new code removals, we have to new commit to do that. Because there are so many different variations, so many code changes already that it doesn't make sense to just roll up back. Yes.
What would be the difference between a kill switch and a feature
The what?
difference between a kill switch and feature flag?
That's a good question. So feature toggle is like it goes through evaluation criteria. So some of the users will get it, but kill switch is everyone gets it or not. So there's no limitation, no like filtering involved. A/B testing has some filtering involved. Yeah. Yes.
Would you leave a kill switch in even for permanent features?
No. Oh, wait. Yes. I think where it makes sense is when you're integrating with third-party frameworks. Sometimes their third-party frameworks are unstable. So even though that's permanent, you want to have a kill switch just in case. Yes.
What kind of development process do you guys have in terms of the process to avoid like too many stale feature flags and switches that stick around?
Right now it's during manual. So we try to ask the PMs and we keep a spreadsheet with all the experiments that are running. And then make sure we identify those that needs to be removed, make permanent. But right now it's like we have so many PMs and each of those PMs they run, or product owners run their own experiments. They sometimes are not aware of the other experiments that are happening. And it could conflict, right? So developers have to be more cognizant of experiments that are running. So it's kind of a manual process right now. If you want to be like hardcore, I'm not going to say that word, you could actually, after a certain time, if those experiments run for like maybe 120 days or 160 days, to automatically remove them without letting the PMs know, or ask them, give them a chance. It's like, hey, this experiment has been running for like 160 days already. We're going to remove them and no one claims those experiments. So you could be hard, ask, and then start removing it. Yeah. Yes.
I'm just thinking about this. So say you've got flag for a new feature and it's on or off. So presumably you write the test for on and test for off. And then when you decide, I don't think I have questions here. When something wins, you've got to go and delete the failing the test that lost as well.
Yeah. So
maybe you use code words to keep that to the code.
so yeah, we actually have a way to enable experiments within our unit test. So we make it easier for that. So we could identify which unit tests belong to which experiments.
I guess you could use the same flag.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's easy for us to identify which one belongs to which ones. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes. Oh, ran out of time. But you can catch me during the conference. Thank you so much. Sure, definitely.
So you said that